The coyote's eyes glowed red in my headlights, but it wasn't the eerie reflection that made my blood run cold. It was the way those eyes blinked, slow and deliberate, almost human-like. In my 15 years patrolling the Navajo reservation, I'd seen some strange things, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. I'd been on the force long enough to know every pothole and curve of these dusty roads. The reservation stretched out for miles in every direction, a patchwork of scrubland and rocky outcrops under an endless starry sky. Most nights it was just me, my cruiser, and the occasional jackrabbit darting across the road. That night started like any other. I clocked in at the station, grabbed a coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since sunrise, and headed out for my usual route. The radio crackled with the usual chatter, a few noise complaints from the nearby town, a lost tourist who'd taken a wrong turn off the highway. Nothing out of the ordinary. As I drove past the old Begay place, a ramshackle house that had been abandoned for years, I noticed something odd. The air seemed to shimmer, like heat waves rising off hot asphalt, but it was a cool autumn night. I slowed the cruiser, my instincts on high alert. That's when I saw it, the coyote. It was standing in the middle of the road about 50 yards ahead. I eased off the gas, not wanting to hit the animal. As I got closer, I realized something was off. The coyote was much larger than any I'd ever seen, its fur a mottled gray that seemed to shift and change in the dim light. I brought the cruiser to a stop about 20 feet away. The coyote didn't move. It just stood there, staring directly at me with those unnerving red eyes. I reached for the spotlight mounted on the side of the vehicle, my hand trembling slightly as I flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the coyote in harsh white light. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, ever so slowly, the animal began to change. It started with the eyes. The red glow intensified, becoming almost painfully bright. Then the snout began to recede, the fur seeming to melt away like candle wax. I watched, paralyzed with a mix of fear and disbelief, as the creature's form twisted and elongated. Where the coyote had stood moments before, there was now a figure that was undeniably human-like, but wrong in ways I couldn't quite process. Its skin was a patchwork of fur and flesh, its limbs too long and jointed at odd angles. The face was the worst, a horrifying blend of human and animal features with those same glowing red eyes boring into me. I fumbled for my radio, my mouth dry as dust. "Dispatch," I croaked. "I need backup at—" But before I could finish, the creature let out a blood-curdling howl that was neither human nor animal. The sound cut through me like a physical force, and I dropped the radio, my hands flying to cover my ears. In that moment of distraction, the skinwalker, for I knew now that's what I was dealing with, moved. 1 second it was in the road, the next it was beside my cruiser, those terrible eyes level with mine through the driver's side window. I'd heard the stories, of course. Every Navajo kid grows up with tales of the skinwalkers, evil witches who could take on animal form. But I'd always dismissed them as just that, stories. Now, faced with the impossible reality before me, I felt a primal fear unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The creature raised a misshapen hand, its fingers ending in wicked claws, and began to scratch at the window. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard, setting my teeth on edge. I knew the glass wouldn't hold for long. Training took over, and I reached for my sidearm with shaking hands. But as I drew my weapon, the skinwalker's form seemed to ripple and blur. Suddenly, instead of the monstrous hybrid, I was looking at myself. It was like staring into a warped mirror. The thing outside my window now wore my face, but twisted into an expression of malevolent glee that I knew my own features were never capable of. It opened its mouth, my mouth, revealing rows of sharp, pointed teeth. "Officer Begay," it spoke, its voice a horrifying imitation of my own. "Why don't you step out of the car? We have so much to discuss." The use of my name sent a fresh wave of terror through me. How did it know who I was? Had it been watching me, following me? The implications were too terrifying to contemplate. I knew I couldn't stay in the cruiser. It was only a matter of time before the skinwalker found a way in, and I refused to be trapped like a rat. With a deep breath, I threw open the door, using it as a shield between myself and the creature. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear despite my best efforts to sound authoritative. I raised my weapon, aiming it at the thing that wore my face. "I will shoot." The skinwalker tilted its head, a grotesque parody of curiosity. "Oh, John," it said, using my first name now. "You know that won't work. We're family, after all." Family? The word hit me like a punch to the gut. Memories I'd long suppressed came flooding back. My grandfather's warnings about our bloodline, the family secret he'd tried to tell me on his deathbed. I hadn't wanted to believe it then, had convinced myself it was just the ramblings of a dying man. But now, "No," I whispered, more to myself than to the creature. "That's not possible." The skinwalker's grin widened, stretching beyond what should have been physically possible. "Search your feelings, cousin. You know it to be true. The power is in your blood, just waiting to be awakened." I felt something stirring within me, a strange heat that seemed to pulse in time with my racing heart. Was this what my grandfather had tried to warn me about? Was the monster before me offering a glimpse of what I could become? "I'm nothing like you," I growled, tightening my grip on the gun. "I protect people. I wouldn't." "Wouldn't you?" the skinwalker purred. "Think of the power, John. Think of all the good you could do. No criminal would escape your justice. No victim would go unavenged." For a moment, just a moment, I felt a flicker of temptation. The power to truly make a difference, to protect my people in ways I never could as a simple police officer. But then I thought of the fear in the eyes of those who'd encountered skinwalkers, the stories of lives ruined and families torn apart. "No," I said, and this time my voice was firm. "I reject you. I reject everything you stand for." The skinwalker's face, my face, twisted in anger. "Fool," it snarled. "You can't escape your destiny. The change will come whether you want it or not. And when it does, I'll be waiting." With that, the creature's form began to shift and blur once more. In the blink of an eye, it had transformed back into the oversized coyote. Before I could react, it turned and bounded off into the darkness, leaving me alone with the desert wind and my racing thoughts. I stood there for what felt like hours, my gun still raised, staring into the emptiness where the skinwalker had vanished. Slowly, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving me shaky and nauseous. I lowered my weapon and leaned against the cruiser, trying to process what had just happened. Part of me wanted to believe it had all been a hallucination. Maybe I'd fallen asleep at the wheel, or the station's ancient coffee machine had finally poisoned me. But I knew deep in my bones that every moment had been real. The encounter had awakened something in me, a knowledge I couldn't unknow, a part of myself I could no longer ignore. As the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, I made a decision. I couldn't pretend this hadn't happened. I couldn't go back to my normal life, not with the weight of this secret, this legacy hanging over me. But I also couldn't give in to what the skinwalker had offered. I got back into my cruiser, my movements mechanical. I radioed in, making up some excuse about engine trouble to explain my long silence. Then I pointed the car towards the reservation's eastern border. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to leave. I had research to do, truths to uncover, and a destiny to outrun. As I drove, watching the sun rise over the mesas, I made a vow. I would find a way to break this curse, to end the cycle of violence and fear that had plagued my people for generations. And if I couldn't, if the change came for me despite my best efforts, well, I'd make damn sure I was far away from anyone I could hurt. The road stretched out before me, empty and full of possibility. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain. My life as I knew it was over. A new chapter was beginning, one filled with danger, uncertainty, and the ever-present threat of the monster within. But as I crossed the reservation boundary, leaving behind everything I'd ever known, I felt something I hadn't expected. Hope. Because if skinwalkers were real, then maybe, just maybe, there was a way to stop them once and for all. The coyote's eyes had awakened something in me that night. Not the curse it had intended, but a purpose. And I intended to see it through, no matter where the road might lead. "Help me! Please, somebody help!" The voice echoed through the dark forest, sounding exactly like my little sister. But that was impossible. Emily was safe at home, hundreds of miles away. I never should have agreed to this camping trip. The Navajo elders had warned us about venturing too deep into these woods, but we were young, stupid, and drunk on our own invincibility. Now, as I huddled in our tent with my 3 best friends, listening to the impossible sounds outside, I realized just how foolish we'd been. It had started as a celebration. The 4 of us, me, Jake, Maria, and Tyler, had just graduated high school. We wanted one last adventure before college scattered us across the country. Jake's uncle owned a cabin near the edge of the Navajo reservation, and it seemed like the perfect spot for a week of hiking, swimming, and sitting around campfires. The first few days were everything we'd hoped for. We explored sun-dappled trails, cooled off in a crystal-clear stream, and stayed up late swapping stories and roasting marshmallows. But there was always an undercurrent of unease, a feeling that we were being watched. On our third night, as we sat around the fire, an old man from the nearby Navajo community approached our camp. His face was deeply lined, his eyes dark and serious beneath a weathered cowboy hat. He introduced himself as Thomas and asked if he could share our fire for a while. We welcomed him, offering him a plate of the fish we'd caught that afternoon. As he ate, Thomas told us about the land we were camping on. He spoke of its beauty, but also its dangers. "This place has old magic," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Powerful spirits dwell in these woods. Some are guardians, but others—" He trailed off, staring into the fire. "Others?" Maria prompted, leaning forward. Thomas sighed. "Others are not so benevolent. Have you heard of skinwalkers?" We shook our heads, except for Tyler, whose grandmother was Navajo. He nodded slowly, his face pale in the firelight. "They're shapeshifters," Thomas explained. "Witches who can take on animal form, but that's not all they can do. They're tricksters, masters of deception. They can mimic voices, lure you away from safety." I laughed nervously. "Sounds like something from a horror movie." Thomas fixed me with a stern gaze. "This is no laughing matter, young one. Skinwalkers are very real and very dangerous. They feed on fear and suffering. If you hear strange noises in the night, voices calling out that seem familiar but impossible, do not follow them. Stay together, stay safe." With that ominous warning, he thanked us for the meal and disappeared into the darkness, leaving us unsettled and full of questions. We tried to shake off the eerie feeling, joking about Thomas being the local crazy old man who liked to scare tourists. But as we turned in for the night, zipping ourselves into our tents, I couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of dread. It was just past midnight when I was jolted awake by a scream. I sat up, heart pounding, trying to orient myself in the pitch-black tent. "Did you guys hear that?" Jake whispered, his voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, we heard it again. A high, terrified shriek that made my blood run cold. It sounded like it was coming from deep in the woods. "Someone's in trouble," Maria said, already reaching for the tent zipper. "We have to help them." I grabbed her arm. "Wait, remember what Thomas said? It could be a trick." Tyler nodded vigorously. "My grandma used to tell me stories about skinwalkers. This is exactly how they operate." We huddled together, listening intently. For a long moment, all we could hear was the rustle of leaves in the night breeze and our own ragged breathing. Then, just as we were starting to relax, thinking it might have been an animal or our imaginations playing tricks on us, we heard something that made my heart stop. "Help me, please, somebody help!" It was Emily's voice, clear as day, coming from the woods. But it couldn't be her. It couldn't. That's your sister," Jake said, looking at me with wide, frightened eyes. I nodded, unable to speak. The voice came again, more desperate this time. Jason, where are you? I'm scared." Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run out there, to find Emily and protect her. But the rational part of my brain knew it was impossible. Emily was back in Arizona with our parents. Whatever was out there, it wasn't her. "We need to call for help," Maria whispered, fumbling for her phone. But as she turned it on, her face fell. No signal. Of course, we were miles from the nearest cell tower. The voice changed then, becoming deeper, more adult. "Kids, are you out there? This is Ranger Stevens. We've got a lost hiker. I need your help." It was the voice of the park ranger we'd met when we first arrived at the campground. But something about it was off, a slightly mechanical quality, like a recording that wasn't quite perfect. "That's not right," Tyler muttered. "Ranger Stevens said he was going on vacation this week. He wouldn't be out here." The voices kept coming, cycling through people we knew. Our parents, our teachers, even celebrities we recognized. Each one sounded desperate, pleading for help. And with each new voice, they seemed to be getting closer to our tent. We huddled together in terrified silence, hardly daring to breathe. The temperature in the tent seemed to drop, and I could see our breath misting in the dim light of Maria's phone screen. Suddenly, there was a scratching sound right outside the tent. long, slow drags like claws or fingernails running along the fabric. We all flinched, pressing closer together. "Jason?" This time it was my mother's voice, soft and worried. "Honey, are you in there? Please come out, I need you." I squeezed my eyes shut, tears leaking out despite my best efforts. It sounded so real, so much like her. Every fiber of my being wanted to unzip the tent and run to her. But I knew, it wasn't really her. "Don't answer," Tyler whispered. "Don't make a sound. If it thinks we're not here, maybe it'll go away." We waited, hardly daring to breathe as the scratching continued. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The voices kept changing, cycling through everyone we knew, becoming increasingly frantic and angry. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, when I was ready to scream or run or do something, everything went silent. The scratching stopped. The voices ceased. Even the natural sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of insects seemed to have been muted. We stayed frozen, straining our ears for any sound. After what seemed like an eternity, Maria whispered, "Is it gone?" As if in answer, there was a new sound, a low, guttural growl that was neither human nor any animal I recognized. It was close, so close it could have been inside the tent with us. The growl rose in pitch, becoming a howl that set my teeth on edge and raised goosebumps all over my body. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it cut off. In the silence that followed, we heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps moving away from our tent and into the woods. None of us slept that night. We sat huddled together, jumping at every sound until the first light of dawn began to filter through the tent fabric. Only then did we dare to unzip the tent and peer outside. The campsite looked undisturbed. There were no footprints, no signs of the terror we'd experienced. But hanging from a low branch of the nearest tree was a coyote's skin, fresh and bloody, swaying gently in the morning breeze. We broke camp in record time, not even bothering to eat breakfast. As we threw our gear into Jake's truck, I noticed Thomas standing at the edge of the woods, watching us. I walked over to him, my legs shaky. "It was real, wasn't it?" I asked. "Everything you warned us about?" He nodded solemnly. "You're lucky to have survived the night. Not everyone does." Will it follow us?" Thomas shook his head. "Skinwalkers are bound to their territory. Once you leave these lands, you'll be safe, but the memory—" He placed a gnarled hand on my shoulder. "The memory will stay with you." As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd brushed up against something ancient and terrifying, a force of nature that didn't care about our modern world or our rational explanations. I knew that none of us would ever be the same. Years have passed since that night, but I still wake up sometimes, heart racing, sure that I can hear my sister's voice calling for help in the darkness. In those moments, I have to remind myself that I'm safe, that the Skinwalker can't reach me here. But deep down, I know the truth. The real horror isn't that monsters exist in the world. It's the knowledge that for one terrible night I was ready to answer that call, to step out into the darkness and embrace whatever was waiting there. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder, what if part of me still is, still? The first orb of light drifted past the window like a curious firefly, casting an eerie blue glow across the cabin's weathered floorboards. I might have dismissed it as a trick of my tired eyes, but then came the sound, a low, guttural growl that was neither wolf nor bear, and all too close to the cabin door. I never should have come to this godforsaken place. 2 weeks ago, inheriting Uncle Joe's cabin in the New Mexico wilderness had seemed like a stroke of luck. A free vacation home, a chance to escape the chaos of city life, and finally finish my novel. Now, as I huddled on the sagging couch, clutching my useless cell phone, no service of course, I realized just how naive I'd been. The trouble started on my third night here. I'd spent the day exploring the dense pine forests surrounding the cabin, marveling at the untouched beauty of it all. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, I headed back to my temporary home. The cabin itself was nothing special. A one-room affair with a small kitchenette, a bathroom that had seen better days, and a loft bedroom accessible by a rickety ladder. But it had electricity most of the time and a wood-burning stove that kept the chill at bay. It was more than enough for my needs. I'd just settled in for the evening, laptop open and a steaming mug of coffee at my elbow, when I heard it. A sound so out of place it made me freeze mid-sentence. It was the cry of a loon, hauntingly beautiful and unmistakable. The only problem? There were no lakes anywhere near here. Loons had no business in these mountains. Frowning, I set my coffee down and moved to the window. The forest outside was dark, the trees little more than looming shadows against the star-studded sky. As I peered into the gloom, the loon's cry came again, closer this time. It was followed by a series of short, sharp barks that sounded canine, but off somehow, too rhythmic, almost like speech. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the night air seeping through the old window frame. I quickly closed the curtains and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. Probably just some local animals I wasn't familiar with. Nothing to worry about. I managed to convince myself of that for all of 10 minutes before the lights appeared. At first, it was just a faint glow on the horizon like distant car headlights. But there were no roads out here, nothing but miles of uninhabited forest in every direction. As I watched, the glow resolved into distinct points of light, orbs of blue-white radiance that bobbed and weaved between the trees with deliberate, almost intelligent movement. My first thought was of the will-o'-the-wisps from old folklore, spirits that lured travelers to their doom in swamps and bogs. But this was no swamp, and surely those were just stories, right? The orbs drew closer, and with them came more sounds, a cacophony of animal cries that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I heard the screech of an eagle, the bugle of an elk, the yowl of a mountain lion. Each sound was perfect, textbook precise, but layered over each other in a way that was decidedly unnatural. Heart-pounding, I retreated from the window and fumbled for my phone. No signal, not even a single bar. Of course not. I was miles from the nearest cell tower. The sounds outside grew louder, more frenzied. Something heavy brushed against the side of the cabin, making the whole structure creak and shudder. I yelped, nearly dropping my phone. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded thin and scared, even to my own ears. "Is someone there?" The response was immediate and chilling. "Hello?" My own voice echoed back to me from just outside the door. "Is someone there?" I stumbled backward, colliding with the kitchen table. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of prank, maybe local kids messing with the city slicker. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something deeply wrong here, something that defied rational explanation. The mimicry continued, cycling through phrases I'd spoken earlier in the day. I heard myself humming a tune I'd been working on, cursing when I stubbed my toe on the uneven floorboards, even the quiet murmur of my voice as I read dialogue aloud from my novel draft. All the while, the lights danced outside the windows, casting wild shadows across the cabin's interior. I caught glimpses of impossible shapes in those shadows, twisted, half-formed things that were neither fully human nor animal. I retreated to the loft, dragging a chair up after me to barricade the flimsy trapdoor. As I huddled against the far wall, I remembered the stories Uncle Joe used to tell during the few times he visited us in the city. Tales of skinwalkers, shape-shifting witches from Navajo legend. I'd always assumed they were just that, legends, campfire stories meant to scare kids and entertain gullible tourists. Now, with unearthly lights flooding through the cracks in the cabin's walls and a chorus of mismatched animal cries filling the air, those stories didn't seem so far-fetched. The assault on the cabin lasted for hours. Sometimes the sounds would die down, lulling me into a false sense of security before starting up again with renewed intensity. The lights pulsed and swirled, and more than once I saw long, dark shapes slithering across the floor below, moving with a fluidity that no natural creature could match. As dawn approached, the commotion outside gradually began to subside. The lights dimmed and retreated, the animal sounds growing fainter until they faded into the normal chorus of early morning birds. I didn't dare move from my spot in the loft until full daylight streamed through the windows. Even then, it took every ounce of courage I possessed to lower the ladder and descend to the main floor of the cabin. Everything looked normal in the harsh light of day. No overturned furniture, no scratches on the walls or floor. If it weren't for the deep, bone-aching exhaustion I felt, I might have been able to convince myself it had all been some kind of vivid nightmare. But then I saw it. A single feather resting on the windowsill. It was like no feather I'd ever seen before, iridescent black shot through with veins of electric blue. When I reached out to touch it, it crumbled to ash, leaving a faint, acrid smell in the air. I packed my bags with shaking hands, throwing clothes and belongings haphazardly into my suitcase. All thoughts of finishing my novel were forgotten. I just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. As I was loading up my car, movement at the edge of the forest caught my eye. An old Native American man stood there watching me with an inscrutable expression. I hadn't seen or heard him approach, and something about his stillness made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, swallowing hard. I don't think this place agrees with me." The old man's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "The spirits here are old and powerful. They do not always welcome outsiders." "Spirits?" I echoed, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in my throat. "Is that what you call them?" He regarded me solemnly. "They have many names: Skinwalker, Yay Nald Lushi, Shaman Gone Bad. But names have power, and it is best not to speak them too freely." I wanted to demand answers, to ask him what exactly had happened last night and why. But the words died in my throat as I met his gaze. There was something ancient and unknowable in his eyes, something that warned me that there were some questions better left unasked. "What should I do?" I finally managed to ask. "Go home," he said simply. "Live your life, write your stories. But remember, the world is larger and stranger than you know, and some places are not meant for men to dwell." With that, he turned and walked back into the forest. I blinked and he was gone, vanished among the trees as if he'd never been there at all. I didn't need any more encouragement. I got in my car and drove away from that cabin as fast as I safely could, not stopping until I'd put 100 miles between me and whatever lurked in those woods. I never went back to claim my inheritance. As far as I know, Uncle Joe's cabin still stands empty in that remote wilderness. Sometimes I think about hiring someone to burn it down, to erase all trace of its existence. But then I remember the old man's warning about spirits and power, and I leave it be. My novel remains unfinished. Instead, I find myself writing down this account, trying to make sense of what I experienced. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened in those woods, but I do know this: there are things in this world that defy explanation, ancient powers that don't care about our modern sensibilities or scientific understanding. And sometimes, when the night is dark and I'm alone with my thoughts, I swear I can hear the echo of those mismatched animal cries and see the faint glow of unearthly lights just beyond my window. In those moments, I remember the old man's words, and I wonder, just how thin is the veil between our world and theirs? And what happens when that veil begins to tear? The old man's eyes bored into mine, his weathered face etched with concern. "The coyote that is not a coyote," he said, his voice low and urgent. "If you see it, run. Do not look back." I nodded politely, struggling to keep the smirk off my face. Little did I know that in less than 24 hours those words would become my lifeline. My name's Alex, and I was, a professional skeptic. Ghostbusters, cryptid hunters, psychic debunkers, you name it, I've written scathing articles about it. So when my editor assigned me to cover the Skinwalker tourism boom in Navajo Nation, I jumped at the chance. Easy pickings, I thought. A week in the beautiful Southwest, taking pot shots at superstitious locals and gullible tourists. Sign me up. The flight to Arizona was uneventful, and I spent most of it outlining my article. I had it all planned out. I'd sprinkle in some local color, throw in a few spooky campfire stories, then wrap it up with a neat little bow of rational explanation. Science and logic triumph again, the usual. I rented a car at the airport and drove out to the small town that was to be my base of operations. It was a dusty little place, all adobe buildings and sun-bleached signs. The kind of town where everyone knows everyone else's business and outsiders stick out like sore thumbs. My first stop was the local diner, a greasy spoon called the Howling Coyote. Real subtle, guys. As I slid into a booth, notebook in hand, I couldn't help but overhear the conversation at the next table. And then, right there in the middle of the road, it just changed. One second it was a coyote, the next it was something else. The speaker was a middle-aged woman, her eyes wide as she recounted her tale to a rapt audience of fellow tourists. I rolled my eyes. Classic urban legend stuff. Probably saw a mangy coyote and let her imagination run wild. "Excuse me," I interrupted, putting on my best friendly journalist smile. I couldn't help but overhear. Would you mind if I asked you a few questions about your experience?" The woman seemed eager to share her story, and I settled in for what I was sure would be an entertaining hour of badly disguised folklore and misidentified wildlife. But as I listened, taking notes and asking the occasional pointed question, I felt a prickle of unease. Her story was consistent, detailed. She described the skinwalker with a precision that was hard to dismiss as mere imagination. And the fear in her eyes, well, it seemed genuine. I shook off the feeling. People can convince themselves of all sorts of things, especially in an unfamiliar environment. Still, by the time I left the diner, my article outline didn't seem quite as solid as it had before. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple, I decided to take a drive. I'd booked a tour for the next day, but I wanted to get a feel for the landscape on my own first. I was about 10 miles out of town when I saw him, an old Native American man standing by the side of the road. He didn't appear to have a car, and there was nothing but empty desert for miles around. Concerned, I pulled over. "You need a ride, sir?" I called out, rolling down my window. He approached slowly, his face grave. "You should not be out here after dark," he said, ignoring my question. "It is not safe." I fought the urge to sigh. Here we go, I thought. "Because of the skinwalkers?" I asked, unable to keep a hint of sarcasm out of my voice. The old man's eyes narrowed. "You mock what you do not understand, young one. The desert holds many secrets, and not all of them are kind to outsiders." I felt a twinge of guilt. Whatever else he might believe, this was clearly a kind old man concerned for a stranger's safety. "I appreciate your concern," I said more gently this time, "but I'll be fine. I'm just taking a short drive." He shook his head sadly. "You have been warned. Remember, the coyote that is not a coyote. If you see it, run. Do not look back." With that, he turned and walked into the desert. "Wait," I called out, suddenly alarmed at the thought of him wandering off into the wilderness. But when I looked, he was gone, vanished, as if the desert had swallowed him whole. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickly rolled up my window. This was ridiculous. I was letting the atmosphere get to me. I turned the car around and headed back to town, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. That night, I tossed and turned in my motel bed, the old man's warning echoing in my mind. When I finally fell asleep, my dreams were filled with shifting shadows and mournful howls. The next morning dawned bright and clear, and in the light of day, my fears seemed silly. I met my tour group at the edge of town, a mix of eager tourists and bored-looking locals who'd probably been roped into playing guide. Our convoy of jeeps set out into the desert, the tour guide's voice crackling over the radio with a mix of local history and thinly veiled ghost stories. I took notes dutifully, mentally composing snarky rebuttals to each claim. We were about 2 hours into the tour when it happened. Our jeep, which had been bringing up the rear of the group, suddenly sputtered and died. The driver swore, popping the hood to peer at the engine. "Looks like a busted fuel line," he announced after a few minutes. "I'll radio for help, but it might be a while. You folks might want to stretch your legs, but don't wander too far." I seized the opportunity to do some exploring on my own. Notebook in hand, I wandered a little way from the jeep, admiring the rugged beauty of the landscape. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the desert floor. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another desert shadow, a trick of the fading light. But then it moved and my blood ran cold. It was a coyote, but wrong. Its proportions were off, its movements too fluid, too purposeful. As I watched, frozen in terror, it seemed to ripple, its form blurring at the edges. The old man's warning crashed over me like a wave. "The coyote that is not a coyote. If you see it, run. Do not look back." I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, my lungs burning, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear something behind me, a sound that was part growl, part human laughter. The jeep loomed ahead, a sanctuary of normality in this nightmare. "Start the car!" I screamed as I approached. The driver looked up, startled, then paled as he saw what was chasing me. I dove into the jeep just as the engine roared to life. As we peeled away, kicking up a cloud of dust, I finally looked back. The coyote stood where we had been, watching us go. But even as I watched, its form began to change. It stretched, elongated, becoming something that was neither human nor animal, but some terrifying combination of both. The ride back to town was a blur. I babbled my story to the shocked driver and the other tourists, all thoughts of skepticism forgotten. By the time we reached the town limits, I was shaking, barely able to string a coherent sentence together. I spent that night huddled in my motel room, jumping at every sound. In the morning, I checked out and drove straight to the airport, my half-written article abandoned, my worldview shattered. As I waited for my flight, an email from my editor popped up on my phone. "How's the SKINWALKER story coming?" she wanted to know. "I bet you've got some great material debunking those old legends." I stared at the screen for a long moment, then slowly began to type. "I regret to inform you that I will not be able to complete the assigned article," I wrote. "Some stories are better left untold, some mysteries better left unsolved. I have seen things that defy explanation, things that have no place in our rational world. I cannot in good conscience dismiss or debunk the beliefs of the Navajo people. There are forces at work in this world that we do not understand and perhaps were never meant to." I hit send, then turned off my phone. As the boarding call for my flight came over the loudspeaker, I took one last look out the window at the desert beyond. For a moment, I thought I saw a familiar figure, an old man standing at the edge of the tarmac, nodding slowly. Then I blinked, and he was gone. But his warning remained, etched into my memory forever. "The coyote that is not a coyote, if you see it, run, do not look back." I boarded my flight, leaving behind the sun-baked land of skinwalkers and shattered certainties. But even as the plane lifted off, carrying me back to the familiar comforts of my old life, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. For I had looked into the eyes of the impossible, and it had looked back. And in that moment, I understood that some warnings are not meant to be ignored, and some truths are too terrifying to face. The CB radio crackled to life, breaking the monotony of the empty highway. "Breaker 1-9, this is Night Owl. Got something on the road about 10 miles ahead. Looks human, but ain't. Y'all be careful out there." The transmission dissolved into static, leaving me with a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. 30 years I'd been driving these routes, and I'd seen some strange things. But nothing could have prepared me for what waited on that moonlit stretch of Arizona asphalt. "Name's Mike Donnelly. I've been a long-haul trucker since before most of you were born. A lot of people think it's a lonely job, and maybe it is for some. But me? I love it. Just me, my rig, and the open road. Beats the hell out of being stuck in some office, that's for sure. This particular night, I was hauling a load of electronics from Albuquerque to Phoenix. It was a run I'd done 100 times before, nothing special about it. Or so I thought. I'd left Albuquerque later than usual, thanks to some loading dock drama I won't bore you with. By the time I hit the Arizona border, it was well past midnight. The moon hung low and heavy in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. I was making good time, the big diesel engine of my Peterbilt humming along nicely. The radio was tuned to some late-night talk show, the host's voice droning on about government conspiracies and alien abductions. Usually I find that stuff amusing, but tonight it was setting my teeth on edge. That's when Night Owl's warning came through on the CB. Now, truckers are a superstitious bunch. We've all got our stories about ghost trucks and phantom hitchhikers. Most times I write it off as too many energy drinks and not enough sleep. But something in Night Owl's voice, it wasn't the usual bullshit. He sounded genuinely rattled. I eased off the accelerator a bit, squinting into the darkness ahead. The highway stretched out before me, empty and silent. Nothing but cacti and tumbleweeds as far as the eye could see. Then about a mile ahead, I saw it. A figure standing smack in the middle of my lane. "Shit," I muttered, slowing down further. Probably just some drunk who'd wandered onto the highway. It happened sometimes out here, usually with tragic results. I flashed my high beams, hoping to get their attention. The figure didn't move. As I got closer, I could make out more details, and that's when the first tendril of real fear started to curl in my gut. The proportions were off. The arms were too long, hanging down past the knees. The head was oddly shaped, almost canine. I was about 100 yards away when it turned to face me. The headlights caught its eyes, and they flashed red like a wolf's eyes in a nature documentary. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. Every instinct screamed at me to swerve, to avoid this thing, but years of training kicked in. You don't make sudden moves in an 80,000-pound vehicle, not unless you want to end up as a cautionary tale at the next safety meeting. So I kept going, slowing down but maintaining my course. 50 yards, 30, 20. At the last possible second, the figure moved, but not to get out of the way. No, it leaped, straight up, higher than any human possibly could. I caught a glimpse of it sailing over my cab, a dark shape silhouetted against the moon. Then came the thud on the roof of my sleeper. "Jesus Christ!" I yelled, the truck swerving slightly before I got it back under control. Something was up there. I could hear it moving, the sound of claws, yes, definitely claws, scrabbling against the metal. I grabbed the CB mic. "Breaker, breaker, this is Big Mike. I've got a..." Christ, I don't know what I've got. Something on my rig. Is anyone out there? Silence, not even static. The radio was dead. A low growl came from above me, and suddenly the passenger side window exploded inward. A long, hairy arm ending in wickedly curved claws swiped at me. I yelled, ducking to the side, somehow managing to keep the truck on the road. "Fuck this," I snarled. I'd be damned if I was going to die on some godforsaken stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. I stood on the brakes, the sudden deceleration causing the tires to screech in protest. The thing on my roof let out a yelp of surprise. I saw a dark shape fly off the front of the truck, hitting the asphalt and rolling several times before coming to a stop about 50 yards ahead. I should have kept going. Should have put the pedal to the metal and never looked back. But I didn't. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was morbid curiosity. Whatever the reason, I brought the rig to a complete stop and, against my better judgment, got out. The night was silent except for the ticking of the cooling engine and my own ragged breathing. I pulled out my heavy-duty flashlight, the kind that could double as a weapon in a pinch, and shone it on the crumpled form in the road. It was changing. That's the only way I can describe it. One second it looked like a man, the next like some kind of huge, mangy wolf. The transformations were happening faster and faster, like a flipbook animation come to life. Then it stopped, and what was left, God, I still have nightmares about it. It wasn't human, it wasn't animal. It was something in between, something that should not exist. Its eyes snapped open, red, glowing, filled with an intelligence and malevolence that froze me to my core. It smiled at me. Rows of razor-sharp teeth gleamed in the flashlight beam. "Thank you," it said, its voice a guttural growl that nonetheless formed perfect words. "I haven't fed on fear like yours in a long, long time." I ran, dropped the flashlight and ran like I've never run before in my life. I could hear it behind me, its laughter mixing with the sound of claws on asphalt. I reached the cab, hurled myself inside, and slammed the door. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life just as something heavy landed on the hood. It crouched there, a nightmare given flesh, grinning at me through the windshield. Slowly, deliberately, it raised one clawed hand and began to trace symbols on the glass, glowing symbols that burned themselves into my brain. I threw the truck into gear and floored it. The thing leaped off at the last second, its laughter echoing in my ears even over the roar of the engine. I drove. I drove until the sun came up, not daring to stop, not even when my bladder felt like it was going to burst. Not until I reached the outskirts of Phoenix did I finally pull over at a truck stop. My hands were still shaking as I walked into the diner. The waitress took one look at me and her eyes widened. "Honey," she said, "you look like you've seen a ghost." I laughed. It came out as more of a sob. "I wish it had been a ghost," I said. She sat me down in a booth and brought me a cup of coffee. As the caffeine hit my system, I started to convince myself that it had all been some kind of hallucination. Too many hours on the road, not enough sleep. Yeah, that had to be it. But then I went back out to my truck, and there on the windshield were those symbols, burned into the glass like acid etchings. I quit the next day, sold my rig, moved to Florida. These days I drive a delivery van in the city. Nice, short routes, always home before dark. But sometimes on quiet nights I still hear that laughter. And I know that somewhere out there on a lonely stretch of highway it's waiting for another unsuspecting trucker to come along. So if you're ever driving through the Arizona desert late at night and you see something strange in the road ahead, don't stop. Don't even slow down. Just keep driving and pray it doesn't catch your scent. Because out there in the darkness, there are things that defy explanation. Things that hunger, and once they've got a taste of your fear, they'll never ever let you go. The image on my camera's screen made my blood run cold. What I'd thought was a coyote had changed. Mid-leap, its form had blurred, elongated, become something that defied explanation. In that frozen millisecond, it was neither animal nor human, but some impossible fusion of both. I lowered my camera with trembling hands, my eyes darting to the desert scrub where the creature had vanished. What the hell had I just photographed? My name is Sarah Chen, and until that moment I was a rising star in wildlife photography. National Geographic, BBC, Discovery Channel, they all wanted my work. I had a knack for capturing animals in their most intimate and unguarded moments. Little did I know that this talent would lead me to uncover something that would shatter my understanding of the natural world. It all started with an assignment from Nature's Lens magazine. They wanted a photo essay on the nocturnal wildlife of the American Southwest. Coyotes, bobcats, maybe even a mountain lion if I got lucky. I'd done plenty of night shooting before, so I figured it would be a straightforward job. God, how wrong I was. I'd been in Arizona for about a week, scouting locations and getting a feel for the landscape. The Sonoran Desert is a harsh but beautiful place, all saguaro cacti and rocky outcrops under an endless starry sky. During the day it was brutally hot, the sun beating down relentlessly. But at night the desert came alive. I'd set up my blind, a small camouflage tent near a watering hole about 20 miles outside of Tucson. It was far enough from the city that light pollution wouldn't be an issue, but close enough that I could make it back to civilization if something went wrong. That night started like any other. I settled into my blind as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. As darkness fell, I could hear the desert awakening around me, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the occasional hoot of an owl. I had my camera ready, a top-of-the-line DSLR with a night vision attachment. Hours passed. I caught some nice shots of a kit fox and a great horned owl swooping down to catch a mouse, but nothing extraordinary. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I heard it, a sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was like a coyote's howl, but wrong somehow. Too deep, too guttural, with an almost human quality to it. I gripped my camera tighter, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw it. A coyote, larger than any I'd ever seen, emerged from the shadows. Even from a distance, something about it seemed off. Its movements were too fluid, too purposeful. It paused at the edge of the watering hole, and for a heart-stopping moment I could have sworn it looked directly at me. I raised my camera, my finger hovering over the shutter button. The coyote lowered its head to drink, and I started shooting. Rapid fire, capturing every movement. Suddenly the creature's head snapped up. It stared into the darkness, ears pricked forward, every muscle tense. Then, without warning, it leaped. My finger kept pressing the shutter, the camera's soft click, 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 barely audible over the pounding of my heart. It was in mid-leap that it happened. The transformation. One frame, it was a coyote. The next, something else entirely. I lowered my camera, my mind reeling. What I'd seen through the viewfinder couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of the light, a glitch in the camera. But deep down I knew it wasn't. For a long moment I sat frozen in my blind, straining my eyes and ears for any sign of the creature. The desert had gone eerily silent. No rustling, no night birds, nothing. It was as if every living thing was holding its breath. Then a sound. Footsteps, but not the pad of animal paws. These were bipedal, the rhythmic crunch of 2 feet walking on desert soil. And they were coming closer. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew that was suicide. Whatever was out there would catch me in seconds. My only hope was to stay hidden and pray it would pass by. The footsteps stopped just outside my blind. I could hear breathing now, heavy and ragged. A shadow fell across the thin fabric of the tent, a silhouette that was vaguely human-shaped, but wrong. The proportions were off, the limbs too long, the head misshapen. "I know you're in there, photographer," a voice growled. It was deep and guttural, like rocks grinding together, but unmistakably forming words. "I can smell your fear." I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a whimper. This couldn't be happening. It was a dream, a hallucination. Things like this didn't exist in the real world. "Come out," the voice continued. "Come out and face me. I want to see the look in your eyes when you realize your precious science can't explain everything." My mind raced. What did it want? Why hadn't it just attacked? Then it hit me, my camera. It wanted the photos. With shaking hands, I pulled out the memory card. It was all I had, my only proof of what I'd seen. But it was also my only bargaining chip. I have what you want," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "The photos, I'll give them to you. Just let me go." A low chuckle came from outside. "Clever girl, but who said anything about letting you go?" The side of the blind ripped open, and I found myself face to face with the stuff of nightmares. It was shaped like a man, but covered in patchy fur. Its face was a horrifying blend of human and coyote features, with glowing yellow eyes and teeth too sharp, too numerous for any natural creature. I screamed then, a primal sound of pure terror. The creature's hand shot out inhumanly fast, clamping over my mouth, its touch burned like ice. "Shh," it said almost gently. "No need for that. I'm not going to kill you. That would be wasteful." With its free hand, it plucked the memory card from my grasp. "I'll be taking this," it said. "Can't have evidence of our existence floating around, can we? Bad for business." It released me and I collapsed, gasping for air. The creature stepped back, regarding me with what almost looked like pity. "You humans," it mused. "So sure you understand the world, so certain in your science and your reason. But there are older truths out there, photographer. Truths your kind have forgotten." It turned to leave, then paused. "A gift," it said, "for your bravery." It plucked a single hair from its arm and let it fall to the ground. "A souvenir. Proof for you, if no one else, that tonight was real." And then it was gone, melting into the shadows as if it had never been. I don't know how long I sat there, shaking, before I finally worked up the courage to leave the blind. The sky was starting to lighten in the east when I stumbled back to my Jeep. I drove straight to the airport, booked the first flight out of Arizona. I couldn't get away fast enough. It's been 2 years since that night. I don't do wildlife photography anymore. Can't bring myself to be alone in the wilderness after dark. These days I shoot weddings and corporate events, nice, safe indoor work. But sometimes, late at night, I take out that single hair course, neither fully animal nor human, and I remember. I remember that there are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk in the shadows of our so-called civilization. And I wonder, with a mixture of fear and fascination, what other secrets are out there, waiting to be discovered by those brave or foolish enough to look. The night I saw something impossible at SKINWALKER Ranch, my whole world changed. I used to be a skeptic, a man of science. Now, I'm not so sure about anything anymore. It was a crisp autumn evening when I first set foot on the infamous SKINWALKER Ranch. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. As a newly hired security guard, I was eager to start my first night shift, though I'll admit there was an undercurrent of nervous energy coursing through me. I'd heard the stories, of course, who hadn't? Tales of UFO sightings, cattle mutilations, and otherworldly creatures roaming the property had been circulating for years. But I was a rational guy. I figured most of it was just superstition mixed with overactive imaginations. Boy, was I in for a rude awakening. The ranch owner had given me a brief tour earlier that day. "Stick to the main areas," he'd said, his eyes darting nervously around the property. "And whatever you do, don't go near the old homestead after dark." I'd nodded, chalking up his unease to the ranch's spooky reputation. As darkness fell, I began my rounds. The ranch was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the dry grass. My flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating the gnarled juniper trees that dotted the landscape. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. I'd been patrolling for about 2 hours when I heard it, a low, guttural sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't like any animal call I'd ever heard before. It was almost human, but not quite. My hand instinctively went to the holster at my hip. I wasn't supposed to use my gun unless it was absolutely necessary, but something about that sound put me on high alert. I swung my flashlight in a wide arc, searching for the source. Nothing. Just as I was about to convince myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I whirled around, heart pounding in my chest. There, at the edge of the flashlight's beam, stood a figure. At first glance, it looked like a man, tall, broad-shouldered, standing perfectly still. But as I focused on it, my brain started to short-circuit. The proportions were all wrong. Its arms hung down past its knees, fingers tipped with what looked like claws. And its face. God, its face. It was like someone had taken a human face and stretched it over a skull that was decidedly not human. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. The creature tilted its head, regarding me with eyes that glowed an unnatural amber in the flashlight's beam. A low growl emanated from its throat, the same sound I'd heard earlier. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. It was like my feet had become one with the earth beneath them. The creature took a step forward, and that's when I noticed something that chilled me to my very core. It was wearing clothes, tattered, dirty clothes, but unmistakably human attire. A ragged flannel shirt hung from its misshapen torso, and what might have once been jeans covered its lower half. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as my mind raced. Was this some kind of elaborate prank? A guy in a costume trying to scare the new security guard? But deep down I knew. This was no costume. This was something else entirely. The creature took another step towards me, and I finally found my voice. "Stop!" I croaked, my hand fumbling for my radio. "Don't come any closer!" To my shock, it obeyed. It stopped its advance, cocking its head to the other side as if curious. Then it did something that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It smiled. The skin around its mouth stretched grotesquely, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. A sound came from its throat, a horrible, grating noise that I realized with dawning horror was an attempt at human speech. "Welcome," it rasped, the word barely recognizable, "to our land." I lost it. Primal fear took over, and I turned and ran faster than I'd ever run in my life. I could hear it behind me, its footfalls unnaturally quick and light for something of its size. I sprinted towards the main house, my lungs burning, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I didn't dare look back, terrified of what I might see gaining on me. Just as I reached the porch, I heard a blood-curdling screech from behind me. It was a sound of frustration, of prey escaping. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I burst into the house, slamming the door behind me and leaning against it, gasping for air. My radio crackled to life, startling me so badly I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Everything okay out there?" It was my supervisor, his voice tinny through the speaker. Thought I heard some commotion. I opened my mouth to reply, to tell him what I'd seen, but no words came out. What could I say? That I'd seen a monster? That the stories about SKINWALKER Ranch were true? "Yeah," I finally managed, my voice hoarse. "Everything's fine, just spooked myself, I guess." There was a pause on the other end. "All right," he said, sounding unconvinced. "Let me know if you need anything." I spent the rest of my shift huddled in the main house, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, I ventured outside, half expecting to see some sign of the previous night's encounter. But there was nothing. No footprints, no disturbed earth, no tattered pieces of clothing caught on branches. If it weren't for the vivid memory seared into my brain, I might have been able to convince myself it was all a dream. I quit that day, told the owner I wasn't cut out for the job. He nodded, unsurprised, and handed me my pay without question. As I was leaving, he stopped me. "You saw something, didn't you?" he asked quietly. I hesitated, then nodded. He sighed, suddenly looking much older. "They always come for the new ones," he muttered. "It's like they're testing you, seeing if you belong here." "What was it?" I asked, my curiosity momentarily overriding my fear. The owner shook his head. "We don't know. SKINWALKER, maybe? Or something else entirely. All we know is that this land, it's not like anywhere else on Earth." As I drove away from SKINWALKER Ranch, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in my rearview mirror, only for it to vanish when I looked closer. It's been years since that night, but I still wake up in a cold sweat sometimes. The image of that creature's twisted smile burned into my mind. I've tried to rationalize it, to explain it away as a stress-induced hallucination or a vivid nightmare, but deep down, I know the truth. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows of places like SKINWALKER Ranch. And once you've seen them, you can never unsee them. I never return to the ranch, but sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that guttural, not quite human voice whispering on the breeze. "Welcome to our land." And I know with bone-deep certainty that somewhere out there in the wilds of SKINWALKER Ranch, that creature is still waiting, watching, and smiling that horrible, inhuman smile. The day I saw a skinwalker at our construction site was the day I quit my job, left town, and started questioning everything I thought I knew about reality. It's been 5 years, and I still can't shake the memory of those eyes, those impossibly human eyes in a face that was anything but. I've been working as a foreman for Redstone Construction for nearly a decade. We mainly handled commercial projects, strip malls, office buildings, that sort of thing. But this job was different. We'd been contracted to build a series of luxury homes on the outskirts of a small town in Arizona, right on the edge of Navajo Nation territory. From the get-go, something felt off about the project. The locals were tight-lipped and unfriendly, shooting us wary glances whenever we went into town for supplies. I chalked it up to outsider syndrome at first. Small towns can be like that, especially when a bunch of rowdy construction workers show up. But as the weeks went by, the atmosphere on the site grew increasingly tense. Tools would go missing only to turn up in bizarre places, like the time we found a power drill perched atop a 20-foot scaffold that no one had climbed that day. There were strange noises at night, not your usual coyotes or wind, but something that sounded almost like laughter, if laughter could curdle milk. My crew started getting jumpy. Rodrigo, one of our best workers, quit without notice after swearing he saw a coyote walking on its hind legs like a man. I didn't believe him, of course, probably just had one too many beers after his shift. Then came that night in late October. We were pushing to finish the foundation on the last house before the first freeze hit. I'd stayed late, double-checking the rebar placement by floodlight. The rest of the crew had headed out hours ago, leaving me alone on the vast, half-built site. I was just about to pack it in when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic thumping coming from the partially framed house to my left. My first thought was raccoons. We'd had trouble with them getting into our materials before. I grabbed my flashlight and headed over, ready to scare off whatever critter had decided to make itself at home. The thumping grew louder as I approached. It sounded almost like footsteps, but too heavy, too deliberate to be an animal. A squatter, maybe? It wouldn't be the first time we'd had to chase off some kids looking for a place to party. "Hello?" I called out, sweeping my flashlight across the skeletal frame of the house. "Anyone in here? This is a construction site. You can't be here." The footsteps stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was nothing but silence and the soft whine of the wind through the unfinished walls. Then, from the darkness beyond my flashlight's beam, came a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a voice, or something trying to be a voice. The closest thing I can compare it to is the sound of gravel in a blender, mixed with the wheeze of a dying man. It formed words barely recognizable. "This, our land." I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "This isn't funny, man. Come out where I can see you." I wish I could go back in time and slap myself for saying that, because whatever was in that house listened, and it came out. It emerged from the shadows like something from a nightmare. At first glance, it looked almost human, bipedal, roughly man-shaped, but as it stepped into the floodlight, I realized with dawning horror that this was no man. Its proportions were all wrong, arms too long, hanging past knees that bent the wrong way. The skin, if you could call it that, was a patchwork of fur, scales, and something that looked disturbingly like human flesh, all melded together in a way that defied biology. But it was the face that truly broke me. Imagine a coyote's snout stretched and flattened over a too-wide human skull, eyes that were unmistakably, terrifyingly human, glowing with an intelligence that had no place in an animal's face. It stood there, head cocked to one side, studying me with those impossible eyes. I was frozen, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a mask, a costume, some sick joke played by one of the locals. Then it smiled, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth, and any hope of rationalization evaporated. "Leave," it growled, the word mangled but unmistakable. "Or become." My paralysis broke. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, dropping my flashlight, not caring about anything except putting distance between myself and that thing. I could hear it behind me, its footfalls a rapid staccato that no human could match. The rational part of my brain screamed that this was impossible, that I was hallucinating, having a mental breakdown. But the primal part, the part connected to countless generations of ancestors who knew when something was trying to eat them, knew better. I reached my truck, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. Just as the engine roared to life, something slammed into the driver's side door. I caught a glimpse of those eyes, that twisted mockery of a face, before I stomped on the gas. The thing, the SKINWALKER, though I didn't know to call it that at the time, clung to the side of the truck for a moment before the force of acceleration tore it free. In my rearview mirror, I saw it standing in the middle of the road, watching me flee. And I swear, even from that distance, I could see it smiling. I drove straight through the night, not stopping until I was 2 states away. I called my boss the next morning and quit over the phone. He wasn't happy, but something in my voice must have conveyed the depth of my terror because he didn't argue. For weeks after, I jumped at every shadow, convinced that thing had followed me. I couldn't sleep without seeing those eyes, that grotesque amalgamation of animal and human. I started researching, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. That's how I learned about skinwalkers, shape-shifting witches from Navajo legend. The more I read, the more certain I became that this is what I'd encountered. But knowing didn't bring comfort. If anything, it made it worse. Because if skinwalkers were real, what else was out there? I've never gone back to Arizona, never worked construction again. These days, I do data entry from home. Safe, boring work that doesn't involve trespassing on ancient lands or tempting forces I can't understand. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind sounds just a little too much like whispers, I find myself looking over my shoulder. And in my dreams, I still hear that gravelly voice, feel those inhuman eyes boring into me. This, our land. And I wake up knowing that somewhere out there in the vast expanse of the Arizona desert, something is waiting, watching, and smiling with too many teeth. The first time I found one of my cows mutilated, I blamed coyotes. The second time, I suspected a sick prank. But when I saw what did it with my own eyes, I realized that some things in this world are beyond explanation, and some terrors are better left in the shadows. My name's Jack, and I've been running my family's ranch just outside Dulce, New Mexico, for going on 15 years now. It's not an easy life, but it's honest work, and there's something to be said for the peace and quiet out here. At least that's what I used to think. It all started on a crisp fall morning about 3 years back. I was out doing my usual rounds, checking fences and making sure the herd was all accounted for. Everything seemed normal at first. The sun was just peeking over the mesas, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The kind of morning that reminds you why you put up with all the hardships of ranch life. Then I saw her. One of my prize Herefords lying motionless in the tall grass about 50 yards from the fence line. My heart sank. Losing livestock is always a blow, both emotionally and financially. But as I got closer, I realized this was something different. Something wrong. The cow's body was pristine, no signs of struggle, no blood on the grass around her, but her face, God, her face. It looked like someone had taken a laser scalpel and removed every scrap of flesh with surgical precision. One eye was missing, and there was a perfect circular incision around the other. Her tongue and soft palate were gone, removed through a hole that had been cut under her chin. I've seen my share of animal attacks and accidents over the years, but this was something else entirely. There were no teeth marks, no tearing, just clean, precise cuts that no wild animal could have made. And strangest of all, there wasn't a drop of blood to be found. I called the sheriff, of course. He came out, took some photos, wrote up a report. But I could tell by the look in his eyes that he was as baffled as I was. He mumbled something about coyotes getting bolder, but we both knew that was bullshit. This was something neither of us had ever seen before. I buried the cow that afternoon, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me like a heavy blanket. I told myself it was a one-off thing, some kind of freak occurrence, but deep down, I knew. Something had changed on my land, and nothing would ever be the same. The next few weeks passed without incident, and I started to relax a little. Then, on a moonless night in early November, it happened again. This time it was 2 cows, same precision cuts, same missing organs. But there was something new this time, a series of strange 3-toed footprints leading away from the carcasses. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot print, and deeper on one side, like whatever made them had an uneven gait. I followed the tracks for about 100 yards before they simply vanished. One minute they were there, clear as day in the soft earth, and the next, nothing. It was like whatever made them had suddenly taken flight. That's when the fear really set in. I started sleeping with a loaded shotgun by my bed. I installed motion sensor lights all around the property, but deep down, I knew that if whatever was doing this decided to come for me, no amount of firepower or illumination would save me. The incidents continued, spaced out every few weeks, always the same surgical precision, always the same missing organs. The sheriff stopped coming out after the fourth call, said there wasn't anything he could do, and suggested I invest in some better fencing. As if a fence could stop whatever was doing this. I started talking to some of the old-timers in town, trying to see if anything like this had happened before. Most of them clammed up as soon as I brought it up, but old Joe Begay, he told me something that chilled me to the bone. "Skinwalkers," he said, his rheumy eyes darting around like he was afraid of being overheard. "Bad medicine. They take the form of animals, but they ain't natural. They're witches, powerful ones. And once they've marked your land, ain't nothing you can do but leave." I didn't want to believe him. Skinwalkers were just stories, myths to scare kids into behaving. But after what I'd seen, could I really discount anything? Then came the night that changed everything. It was a full moon, and I was out checking the herd one last time before turning in. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural sound that was like no animal I'd ever heard before. It was almost human, but twisted, wrong. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, and for a split second I saw it. A figure hunched over one of my cows. It was vaguely human-shaped, but too tall, too thin. Its skin seemed to shift and ripple in the moonlight, like it couldn't decide what form to take. Then it turned and looked at me. Its eyes glowed an unnatural yellow in the beam of my flashlight. The face, if you could call it that, was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features. A long, pointed snout filled with razor-sharp teeth, ears that were too large, too pointed, and those eyes, God, those eyes. They were filled with an intelligence that no animal should possess, and a malevolence that made my blood run cold. For a moment we just stared at each other. Then it smiled, a horrific parody of a human expression that revealed row upon row of gleaming teeth. And it spoke. The voice was like gravel being ground together, barely recognizable as speech. But I understood the words all the same. This land, ours now. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, not daring to look back. I could hear it behind me, its footfalls unnaturally quick and light for something of its size. I made it to the house, slamming the door behind me and fumbling for my shotgun. For hours I sat there in the dark, jumping at every sound, the gun trained on the door. But nothing came. When dawn finally broke, I ventured outside. The cow lay where I'd seen it, mutilated in the same way as all the others. But this time there was something new, a symbol carved into the earth nearby. It looked like a twisted version of a human figure surrounded by jagged lines that might have been meant to represent fur or scales. I knew then that this was more than just random attacks. This was a message, a warning. This skinwalker was laying claim to my land, and it wasn't going to stop until it drove me out. I'd love to say I stood my ground, that I fought back against this supernatural terror, but the truth is, I ran. I packed up what I could, sold the remaining cattle for a fraction of what they were worth, and got the hell out of Dodge. These days, I live in a small apartment in Albuquerque. I work a 9-to-5 job and try not to think about the ranch, about what I saw that night. But sometimes when the wind howls just right, I swear I can hear that guttural voice again. This land, ours now. And I know with a bone-deep certainty that somewhere out there on my old property something is waiting, watching, and smiling with too many teeth. The night the power went out, I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. I've spent every day since trying to convince myself it wasn't real. But deep down, I know the truth. And I know it's still out there, waiting. It was a Friday night in late October, unseasonably cold for northern Arizona. I'd just moved into my grandfather's old cabin a few weeks prior, still adjusting to the solitude after years of city living. The cabin sat on the edge of a vast expanse of wilderness, miles from the nearest neighbor. Most nights I reveled in the peace and quiet, but not that night. I'd settled in for a quiet evening of reading by the fireplace, a glass of whiskey at my elbow and my old golden retriever, Max, snoring softly at my feet. The wind had picked up as the sun set, whistling through the pines and rattling the windows. I remember thinking I should probably trim back some of those branches come morning. It was just past 10 p.m. when the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. The sudden darkness was absolute, broken only by the faint glow of embers in the fireplace. I fumbled for my phone, using its dim light to navigate to the kitchen where I kept a flashlight and some candles. That's when I heard it, a soft thud from the front porch, followed by the creak of weathered wood. Max's head shot up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Probably just a raccoon," I muttered, more to reassure myself than anything. But Max's hackles were up, his eyes fixed on the front door with an intensity I'd never seen before. I grabbed the flashlight, flicking it on and sweeping the beam across the room. The windows were dark, reflecting nothing but my own tense face. I approached the door slowly, Max at my heels, his growl growing louder with each step. Just as I reached for the doorknob, something slammed against the other side with enough force to rattle the frame. I jumped back, my heart pounding. This was no raccoon. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "I'm armed and I've called the police." A lie, but whatever was out there didn't need to know that. Silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then from just beyond the door came a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a voice, or something trying to be a voice. The closest I can describe it is the sound of dry leaves scraping across concrete, formed into words that were just barely recognizable. "Let me in." I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over Max. The dog was in a full-on snarl now, his teeth bared at the door. "Go away!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "I'm warning you, I'll shoot." Another slam against the door, harder this time. I heard wood splinter. Panic took over. I grabbed Max by the collar and dragged him toward the back of the cabin, toward my bedroom where I kept my grandfather's old hunting rifle. We'd barely made it halfway when the front door exploded inward in a shower of splinters. In the beam of my dropped flashlight, I caught a glimpse of something, a figure hunched and misshapen, silhouetted in the doorway. It was roughly man-shaped, but too tall, its proportions all wrong. Arms that hung past its knees, ending in hands tipped with what looked like claws. And its face. God, its face. In the split second before I turned and ran, I saw a nightmare blend of human and animal features. A snout too long to be human, too short to be animal. Eyes that glowed an unnatural yellow in the flashlight's beam. And teeth, row upon row of gleaming razor-sharp teeth exposed in what I could only describe as a grin. I slammed my bedroom door shut, fumbling with the lock before remembering it was broken. Max huddled against my legs, whimpering. I could hear it moving through the cabin, its footsteps unnaturally light for something of its size. With shaking hands, I retrieved the rifle from under my bed and loaded it. I'd never fired it before, it was more of a family heirloom than a weapon, but its weight was reassuring in my hands. "Get out!" I yelled, trying to sound braver than I felt. "I've got a gun and I'm not afraid to use it." That horrible grating laugh again, closer now, right outside my door. "Gun won't help," it rasped. "I am everywhere." The doorknob turned slowly. I raised the rifle, my finger tightening on the trigger. The door swung open. I fired. The blast was deafening in the confined space. The kickback sent me stumbling backward. When my vision cleared, I expected to see, I don't know, a body, blood, something. But the doorway was empty. For a long moment, I stood there, the gun still raised, ears ringing. Had I imagined it all? Was I losing my mind? Then I saw the footprints. Large, three-toed prints pressed into the old wooden floorboards, leading from the shattered front door to my bedroom. They ended abruptly at the threshold, as if whatever had made them had simply vanished into thin air. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back against the wall, the rifle across my lap, Max pressed close against my side. Every creak of the old cabin, every whisper of wind through the broken door sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through my system. When dawn finally broke, I ventured out cautiously. The cabin was a mess. Furniture overturned, claw marks gouged into the walls. But of the creature itself, there was no sign. I spent the morning boarding up the broken door and windows, trying to convince myself that it had all been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But I couldn't shake the memory of those glowing eyes, that twisted grin. It was mid-afternoon when old Joe from the nearby Navajo reservation showed up. He said he'd seen my lights were out and wanted to check if I needed anything. But the look in his eyes when he saw the state of the cabin told me he knew more than he was letting on. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked quietly, his weathered face grave. The Skinwalker. I nodded, the words sending a chill down my spine. I'd heard stories about skinwalkers, shape-shifting witches from Navajo legend, but I'd always dismissed them as campfire tales. Joe sighed heavily. They're drawn to newcomers, he said, testing you, seeing if you belong here. What do I do? I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. Protection, he said, pressing it into my hand. Blessed by a medicine man. It won't stop the skinwalker, but it might keep it at bay. I clutched the pouch, wanting to believe in its power. Will it come back? Joe's eyes met mine, filled with a sadness that spoke volumes. It never truly leaves, he said softly. This is its land, we're just guests. He left soon after, leaving me with more questions than answers. I hung the protective pouch by the door and spent the next few weeks jumping at every shadow, every unexplained sound. Slowly, life settled back into a routine. The nights grew longer, the air colder, but I never forgot. Never let my guard down completely, because sometimes on nights when the moon is hidden and the wind howls just right, I swear I can hear that gravelly voice again. And in the darkest corners of the cabin, I catch glimpses of yellow eyes watching, waiting. I know now that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows of lonely places, testing the boundaries between their world and ours. And I know that somewhere out there in the vast wilderness beyond my cabin, the Skinwalker is waiting, watching, and smiling with too many teeth.